Hi, everybody. Now we're going to talk about the endocrine system and how it helps to control the sequence of events that happens in our body. We're going to see homeostatic feedback loops and all kinds of good things here. Um, so remember that the endocrine system has a lot of functions actually, and so it's one of the main ways that we use to help control homeostasis. So we have there regulate organic metabolism and water and electrolyte balance, induce adaptive changes to help the body cope with stressful situations, helps to coordinate growth patterns as well in the body. It controls reproduction. So we'll look at that when we do the male and female reproductive systems. You saw already when we looked at the kidney that help regulate cell production. So remember that since the kidney receives so much blood, it can actually determine the number of red blood cells. And if we're low, it releases erythropoietin. So EPO, remember that was a hormone that targets the bone marrow. And so it gets the bone marrow to, it gets the bone marrow to start ramp up production of red blood cells. And then also it's, whoops, my thing kind of moved on you. It also works alongside of the autonomic system. Remember that that in order to stimulate our organs to do whatever needs to be done in a situation, we usually start with the autonomic system kicking in first. But remember that nerve cells can't keep up action potentials for a long period of time. So in concert with the nervous system kicking in, the endocrine system will start releasing hormones into the bloodstream in order to keep up the effects that the autonomic system started. So again, remember, for example, if you got frightened about something and you had a sympathetic response, right? And maybe you had to run away from something, the sympathetic response then are sympathetic nerves that get your heart to beat faster and to beat more strongly, right? That gets more blood flow going. Your respiratory rate will increase in order to get more oxygen into the bloodstream so that can be carried around to the body. It will dilate blood vessels to the skeletal muscles so that the skeletal muscles are ready to go. But again, the endocrine system the nervous system can't keep that up for a long period of time. So while that's happening, remember that the sympathoadrenal pathway is releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine. So those are the hormones that get released into the blood so that that will target maybe the heart to keep the blood pumping faster, right? To keep the heart rate up, to keep the contraction rate going, the strength of the contraction. And so therefore, these two systems working alongside of one another really helps to keep the situation going as we need it. And think about it, after you've maybe run away from something and you get into a safety area, you don't just suddenly stop and just start breathing normally and your heart goes immediately back to normal. It doesn't. If it was just your nervous system, it would, because as soon as the nerves turn off, then that stimulation would be gone. But we'll see in a minute with endocrine system, you've got these hormones now coursing around in your bloodstream. And so therefore, as long as they're in the bloodstream, you're going to still get a response. So it's going to take some time to break down those hormones, to break down their effects. Okay. So here's the endocrine system itself. So the endocrine system is a series of endocrine glands scattered throughout the body, and refer to them as being ductless, right? So they don't have a pathway leading out of epithelial tissue, right? This is secreted directly into the bloodstream. Okay, so again, a gland that has a duct, that's like your sweat glands or something like that. Remember, so that was made out of epithelial tissue and had a little passageway going up. The glands in your stomach, those have ducts in order to produce the secretions for digestion and things like that. The pancreas had a duct that traveled through it, right? Endocrine glands, again, their hormones don't get secreted through a duct onto an epithelial surface. They get secreted directly into the bloodstream, and then they travel through the bloodstream. And then they'll just be indiscriminately traveling through the bloodstream until it makes it into, until it gets released out of a capillary bed toward the tissue. So the tissue that it gets released at, remember, again, it's just indiscriminate. It'll just leak out of the capillaries no matter where bloodstream, right? And so, but that tissue, if it responds to the hormone, it will, because it has a target receptor. It's a target cell, so it has a receptor for it. Okay, so that means we kind of lose a lot of hormones, maybe waste some hormones at tissues that don't have any receptors, so they're not the target organ. Okay? And so our hormones and the receptors are very specific. And that's one way that we control the effects of specific hormones, or how we control the effect of an organ. It's got to have a specific hormone to stimulate that effect. Okay. And one way that we know if an effect is how something's going to be stimulated is our hormones get, they can get classified into these two groups. They're hydrophilic or they're lipophilic, right? And so a hydrophilic hormone, remember, is one that is water soluble. So that means that it can travel the blood easily because the blood is mainly water. And so this hormone can dissolve within the blood and be carried around. Okay, but it can't cross the lipid membrane. So that's going to have consequences to how it gets released from the endocrine glands. And you see the different endocrine glands here, and how it binds to the receptor. Okay, and I'll show you that in a minute. The other hormones are lipophilic, fat loving, or you could call them hydrophobic. That's also correct to say, right? So lipophilic or hydrophobic means they don't dissolve well in water. Okay, they're more lipid soluble. So that has consequences. It can actually diffuse across the membrane really easily. Okay, so it can get in and out of cells really easily, but it can't travel through the blood very easily, right? So I actually do have this, I found this nice picture here. So this shows you, I put hydrophobic up here. Again, lipophilic is the same as hydrophobic. But notice in the first panel, you see that this is a water-soluble hormone. So this one's hydrophilic, right? And so again, it can't cross the cell membrane. This is the gland that's making it, the hormone. So it's actually got to be released by exocytosis. Remember, cells don't have to cross a membrane through exocytosis because the membrane just merges with the membrane of the cell. But now it can travel through interstitial fluid and blood really easily because it's water soluble. But then when it gets out of the capillary and encounters a target cell, it won't be able to cross the cell membrane of the target cell. So the receptors of the target cell are at the surface of the membrane. So the hormone never enters. The hormone just binds to the target cell. And we kind of saw this already in the beginning of the semester when we talked about different effects of other signaling molecules, right? So this is real similar with hormones and things. When you looked at the G protein cascade, this could start a G protein cascade, right? So, so that would be a cytoplasmic response. It could cause a response, again, stimulate events within the cell that would turn on a gene. And then the gene would cause a cytoplasmic response. So, but the big point is here, it's hydrophilic or water soluble. So the target cell is going to have a surface receptor and the hormone attaches to the surface. It does not cross the cell membrane, just like a neurotransmitter did. In this picture, you see a lipid soluble hormone or a hydrophobic hormone. So those can cross membrane, because the cell membrane is made of lipids. So those can just diffuse across when they're made. So they can get into the bloodstream easier, but they can't be carried around in the bloodstream unless they attach to a target protein, or I'm sorry, a transport protein. So remember, we have some transporter proteins within the blood. Those help to carry hydrophobic or lipophilic molecules. Okay, but then once they reach their target cell, the receptor tends to be inside of the cell. So they don't need the surface receptor. So here you can see the signaling receptor is actually inside of the nucleus. So a lot of our lipophilic hormones are gene regulators. They go straight into the nucleus and turn on or turn off a gene, as the case may be. Okay. So that brings us to our chemical classification of hormones. Okay, hormones can be made out of several different types of chemicals. Righty, so peptide hormones are just chains of amino acids. Remember that amino acids are bound to one another by peptide bonds. So that's why we call these peptide hormones. And they could go on, if it gets more complex, it might actually be a protein. So some hormones might be, the precursor to a protein, which is our peptides. Okay, or it might be a whole protein. And most of our hormones are peptide. And so I just kind of put a list here. It's not all of them. Some are derived from amino acids. So we call those amine hormones. So those are things like the catecholamines. We already looked at norepinephrine and epinephrine. Remember, those are derived from tyrosine. So you need the amino acid tyrosine in order to make norepinephrine and epinephrine. You need the amino acid tryptophan in order to make melatonin. So these are considered hydrophilic hormones, right? So they would be like this one. They would have to be released by exocytosis from the gland. They can travel through the blood easily. Their receptors are going to be on the outside. Okay, this also has an effect on how easily they're broken down. Remember, I said we're going to put a lot of hormone into the bloodstream because these hormones just travel indiscriminately throughout the blood. And so there has to be enough of them in the blood, so enough of them make it to the target cell, right? So if they travel easily, being water soluble, that means they can travel a little bit faster. That means they also get cleaned out of the blood by the kidney pretty fast. And so usually with many of these, the effects can be broken down, can only last sometimes hours to weeks because the kidney can clean it out pretty fast. And our lipophilic ones, the kidney may not be able, it won't cross the membrane at the kidney. So the kidney will have a harder time breaking these down. These might have to be broken down by the liver. So they might take a little bit longer in order to break down. Okay. And so here are lipophilic or hydrophobic hormones. So the steroids, these are hormones that are derived from cholesterol. So here's a list. We'll talk about many of these today. And also the hormones that your thyroid makes. These are lipophilic. They are derived from tyrosine, but they're also, some of the other parts of the molecule makes them lipophilic. Okay. Yeah, trying to think where I want to go with this. I think that's good enough for that. Okay. And so some of these hormones are what we call tropic hormones. Tropic hormones regulates the secretion of another hormone from another gland. So we're going to see this when we do the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will actually control the release of a hormone at the thyroid gland, right? So the anterior pituitary on this picture is releasing a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. That's a tropic hormone because it then causes the thyroid gland to make and release its hormone, which is thyroid hormone. Okay, so tropic actually means nourishing. So it kind of nourishes this tissue, and you even get a little growth of the tissue in the gland while it's secreting. And so that it makes and secretes the hormone that it's going to secrete. And then that hormone is going to target another organ, right? So thyroid hormone actually targets most cells in your body. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But this is showing you that many times then the hormone released by the stimulated gland is the negative effect on the original hormone that's controlling its release, right? So this is a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, so that the anterior pituitary doesn't just keep stimulating the thyroid gland. Okay, so it's under negative feedback control. So we're going to see this a lot, especially with the anterior pituitary. It makes 5 tropic hormones. So that means there's going to be a sequence of events that we're going to see in the release of these hormones from the anterior pituitary, what their target organ is, and then what hormone that one releases. All righty. Yeah. All right. So from there, so this is all just kind of background. Okay, so we're going to go over real closely in depth about how the thyroid gland gets stimulated and what it controls. Okay, and so remember I mentioned that hormones, since they travel in the blood, they're slower to act. They do have to first get secreted in a large enough proportion in order to have an effect. So again, the concentration is influenced by, right there, the hormone rate of secretion. Okay, so how quickly it gets secreted into the bloodstream. And again, hydrophilic and hydrophobic hormones are going to be excreted at a different rate, right? Some hormones get secreted into the blood and they're inactive. So how quickly then the target cell can activate it or convert it into the active form. So that's also going to affect that, right? That plasma concentration. How they're transported. I just went over that with you, with if it's water soluble, hydrophilic, travels really easily through the blood. But if it's hydrophobic or lipophilic, it's got to be attached to a transporter protein, and that's going to take a little longer. So that's going to affect how quickly the concentration in the plasma, this hormone, builds up, right? And then how quickly it gets inactivated. Okay, that's also going to affect how quickly the hormone not only exerts its effect, but how long, right? So if the hormone can be broken down relatively quickly, then the effects of the hormone may only last hours to weeks. We have some hormones whose effects can be felt for weeks to months, sometimes even years. Okay, and that also goes along with the excretion rate. Okay, so how quickly we can inactivate it and then also excrete it from the body. And so I kind of mentioned that already. Water soluble hormones can easily be filtered out by the kidney. But some of the lipophilic hormones, they can persist for hours, like steroids, and sometimes weeks, like thyroid hormone. So just the effects that hormones have. And then sometimes hormones influence one another. So sometimes it's not just about the effect that one hormone has. Hang on, I'm going to pause just a second. Okay, so a hormone can influence other hormones, and many times a certain hormone's effects need to be enhanced by a different hormone. So, for example, and there are 3 ways that a hormone can influence another hormone at the given target cell. Okay, so if it's going to enhance it, one of those ways that it does it is through permissiveness. So again, one hormone must be present in adequate amounts for the full exertion of the other hormone's effect. Okay, so example, thyroid hormone is actually important in increasing the number of receptors for epinephrine at epinephrine's target cells, right? So thyroid hormone isn't directly targeting the target cells themselves, but having thyroid hormone present actually just allows the target cells to insert more receptors for epinephrine. So then when epinephrine gets released, then epinephrine's effectiveness has been increased. Okay. Later on, we're going to talk about the reproductive system. And so the uterus gets exposed to estrogen, and that causes the formation of receptor proteins for progesterone, which gets released later. Okay, so that's a permissive effect on progesterone. And so it really just improves the response of the uterus to progesterone. And this all has to do with the lining during the menstrual cycle. And we're going to go over that in depth when we do the reproductive system. Okay. For synergism, it says there, it occurs when actions of several hormones are complementary to one another. So that means the combined effect of the hormones is greater than the sum of their separate effects. So that means they both directly act on the target cell, but having both hormones present, you have a bigger effect. Okay, so for example, in men, when men make a sperm, you need two hormones, one called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and the other one is testosterone. So each hormone influences the number of receptors or even sometimes the affinity of the receptor to the other hormone. And so research has shown that men have a higher rate of sperm production if they have both hormones present. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So that's a synergistic effect. Okay. So again, they can be either additive or complementary to one another. Even epinephrine and norepinephrine, they both individually increase heart rate, but together they stimulate at a greater rate. So two is better, but they can both act on it individually as well. And then the third way is the opposite. It's an antagonistic response. So one hormone can cause the loss of another hormone's receptors, and then that means it's going to reduce the effectiveness of that second hormone. So again, pregnancy is another example of this. As progesterone levels really increase, that decreases the contraction of the uterus, and it inhibits the uterine responsiveness to estrogen, right? And so the loss of estrogen receptors on the uterine smooth muscle then quiets the uterus. And that's what you want during pregnancy. You don't want the uterus to start contracting and things. So all of this stuff is really well balanced. Okay. And some more hormonal control, how we control our hormones. For when a hormone starts to get released into the bloodstream and starts to react to a target cell, or a target cell starts to react to it, the target cell, that will influence the target cell to start to create more receptors for that hormone. So that's called upregulation or a priming effect. So again, the hormone is just inducing more of its own receptors on the target cell. So not only will more hormone start to get released from the endocrine gland, but now its target cells are much more sensitive to the hormone. So again, that's upregulation, or what's called a priming effect. The opposite can happen as well. So if there's a prolonged exposure to high levels of hormone, then what happens is the target cells start to become desensitized to it. That's also called a downregulation, right? And so, for example, we see this with in diabetes. So a person who has a high exposure to carbohydrates, right? This is usually the sequence of events that happens in type 2 diabetes. So if there's always a high exposure to carbohydrates, then that will induce the pancreas to continuously release more and more insulin. But what happens is the target cells just keep getting bombarded with insulin, that they'll just start to ignore insulin. So that's a downregulation, right? But if this keeps going for too long, now the person has lost the ability to really regulate their blood glucose levels, right? So in order to prevent downregulation, most, at least the peptide hormones, tend to have what's called pulsatile secretion. So what it means is it'll secrete a bunch into the blood, but then stop, and then a bunch more, and then stop. So it kind of primes the blood, gets a good level in the bloodstream, but it doesn't continuously keep the high level of hormone in the bloodstream. So that just prevents that downregulation. All righty. So I think I'm going to stop this video here. This will be part 1. And so part 2, so that was just kind of the background of the endocrine system. So now we'll start to get into the specific endocrine glands and what their functions are. So stay tuned for part 2. We'll talk about the pituitary gland.